We are going to learn about what is so special about serving a talmid chacham, a Torah scholar. Why is that so important, and why is it even better than learning from him? The answer is, it's from the first pasuk in Sefer Yeshua. Pasuk over here says that it was after the death of Moshe, who was an Eved Hashem. Vahi achrei Moshe Eved Hashem, vayomer Hashem Yehoshua ben Nun, Mesharis Moshe Lemor. Hashem told Yehoshua, the son of Nun, who was a servant of Moshe, saying, let's go in order over here. We're going to start with Radak. Radak says, Mesharis Moshe, V'hu haya b'makom Moshe l'seis v'lavov b'nei Yisrael. He was in place of Moshe. He was going and forth bringing the Jews. Okay, comes along the Ralbag and says, Acharei Moshe Eved Hashem, as Diber Hashem Yehoshua. Right after Moshe died, who was an Eved of Hashem, a servant of Hashem, Hashem spoke to Yehoshua. Ilu hadavodim. He spoke to him the following things. Now he called Yehoshua a servant of Moshe to show that the reason that Yehoshua shehasiba haisa lahoyer shehasiba haisa behig also lemadregas hanavu. What's the reason that Yehoshua reached such a high level of prophecy? He yoisoi mishares Moshe. It was because he served Moshe. Yehoshua was always with his Rebbe Moshe. V'lomod michachmaso. Yehoshua learned from the wisdom of Moshe, umehan hagaso, and from his actions, bekol pu'ulasav, from all of his acts that he did. Mashlo hayaderech letalmid she'edim esharis eloimdo, which is abnormal for a student who doesn't serve his teacher. You typically won't learn about that. Amar, that's why it says over here, Po Elisha ben Shafar, Asher Yatzak Mayim al Yedei Eliyahu, that Elisha he poured water on the hands of Eliyahu. We're going to learn about that more. And that's what the rabbis mean when they teach us. We're going to see the Gemara inside that it's greater to serve a talmid chacham than learn from him, greater to serve a Torah scholar than learn from him. Comes along the Malbim and says that Yehoshua only merited his high level of prophecy and being such a successful leader that he was because he was a servant of Moshe. And it's greater to serve than to learn from a Torah scholar. He's called an Eved Hashem. Even after he died, he's still called an Eved Hashem. Because when a righteous person dies, his service continues because of all the people who he positively affected. Before we continue, we should quote the first Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. The Mishnah opens up by saying, Moshe kibel Torah Sinai. That Moshe received the Torah from Har Sinai and Marsha Yehoshua, and he gave it to Yehoshua. Rashi over there says, why did Moshe give the Torah to Yehoshua? Why not to the 70 Zakanim, the 70 elders, to Pinchas, to Elazar? What's the explanation? You know what Rashi says? He says exactly what we're discussing. That Moshe only wanted to transmit the Torah to someone who would kill himself from his youth in the tents of the wise people. And he acquired a great name in this world. That is Yehoshua. That's Rashi's answer. That's why he specifically wanted to give it to transfer the Torah to Yehoshua. Take a look now at the Be'er Moshe, who discusses this exact topic at hand. It says over here that Yeshua is called Mesharis Moshe, servant of Moshe. Why? Because he merited to be a leader. Merited to be a leader. Because he was a servant of Moshe, that's why he merited being a leader. As it says in the Bamidbar Rabbah, based on this pasuk over here. And that's why it doesn't say that Yehoshua, the pasuk doesn't say that Yehoshua was a talmid of Moshe. He wasn't a student of Moshe. He was a Mesharis Moshe, a servant of Moshe. Because it's greater to serve a talmid chacham more than from learning from one. And therefore, he says that that's why he merited is to be a great leader on prophecy, like we just saw. Because he served, that's why he merited what he merited. Then at the end he says, "V'harizeh ha'orah l'doros." This is an instruction for future generations. She'efshar liyois maneg Yisrael rak achrei shimush gedoy li hador. It's impossible to be a leader of the Jewish people unless you serve the great people of the generation. Valide anov of the shiflus ki Yeshua. Shasa atzma mashar says it was due to the incredible humility that Yehoshua possessed. That's why he merited serving as well. All of this discussion makes us now turn over to the Gemara and Brachos. Gemara and Brachos is the source for all of this discussion that we're mentioning over here. Gemara and Brachos Zayin and Beis. We go down over here. We have a statement of Rabbi Yochanan. Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, "Gedolu shimusha shel Torah yoser milimudo." Here it is. It's greater to serve a talmid chacham rather than from learning from one. Why? Mishum shenemar, because the pasuk says, "State po Elisha ben Shafat asher yotzak mayim al yedei Eliyahu." That Elisha ben Shafat, he came and he poured water on the hands of Eliyahu. The pasuk over here is describing the essence of Elisha. This pasuk in Malachim is describing the essence of who he was. He is someone who poured water on the hands of his teacher, of his rabbi, of his Rebbe, Eliyahu. Lamar loy nemar, says the Gemara. It doesn't say that that Elisha learned from Eliyahu. Eliyatzak. Rather, it says that what? That Elisha learned. That he poured water on the hands of Eliyahu. It doesn't say that he learned from him. Oh, Elisha was great because he learned Torah from Eliyahu. It's not true. It's because he poured water on his hands, aka he served him. From here we can learn that it's greater to serve a talmid chacham than to learn from a talmid chacham. I'd like to just foreshadow something that we're going to go into a little bit more. The Rabbi Akiva Eiger and his Gilyon Hashas over here on the glass, he referencing something. I'm going to zoom that in. He says over here, he says, look at Taisvis in Ksubos Yud Zayin Amar Aleph Dibra Maskum Avatle. Could go a little out of order. Let's go straight to Taisvis. Gemara over there says, Tanur Rabbanan Mevatlin Talmid Torah Lohatzos Meis Lochnas Kala. That we stop learning Torah for two things: to take out a deceased, aka a funeral, a levaya, ulachnasas kala. Lachnasas kala is to go to a chasana, to go to a wedding. That's it. Only thing we stop learning for. Says Taisus. Behiksha. The Behilchas Derech Eretz Amar Rabbi Akiva. The Chilus says in Hilchas Derech Eretz, he calls it, which this is a Meseches Derech Eretz. If you actually take a look over here on the bottom, well, first I just want to point out where I'm coming from over here. Where Taisus says Hilchas Derech Eretz, there's a chaf. This letter chaf. Okay, where does that chaf go? This chaf goes all the way down here. Down here. It should say Meseches Derech Eretz. Meseches Derech Eretz Zuta. You have Meseches Derech Eretz Zuta and Araba, Paraches. So what does it say over there, Meseches Derech Eretz? It's one of the Mesechtes Ketanos. Meseches Derech Eretz. Little story. Amar Rabbi Akiva, Techilas Tashmishi Lifnei Chachamim. When I first started serving Talmidei Chachamim, and I started learning under them, serving them, one time I was walking on the way, and I found the deceased. V'niflesi boy, and his palti bo dalid minim. I carried the corpse for duration, for a distance, of around 4 miles. Ad sheviosiv beis hakafos, until I brought the deceased to the cemetery of Kfarsiv, and I buried him. When I told Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua about what's going on over here, Amruli, they told me, Al kol psiu psiu ki ilu shafachta dam naki, and every single step that you took, it's as if you poured and you spilt innocent blood. What on earth is going on over here? Every single step that he took, innocent blood? What do you mean? We just saw in the Gemara that you're supposed to stop learning in order to bury someone. So how could it be that it's as if he did murder? It was a bad thing. Seems like it was a big mitzvah. Great deed. Yishleimer, and for Taisvus answers, the Hasam Lav Mishum Bittul Torah. Over there, we're not talking about that it was a nullification that he wasn't learning Torah and he should have. We're not talking about that because we said you're supposed to go to bury someone. One answer is when you have a mace mitzvah, which means a dead body and no one could bury it, it acquires its place, and therefore you could just bury it right then and there. It's obviously talking about thousands of years ago that in an area that wasn't so habited, and you bury it there in its place. You should have buried it where you found it. It's also implied. Maseches Smachos from Maseches Smachos that way as well. Perik Daled Dika Amar says over there, mace mitzvah kana makayma, that a mace mitzvah acquires its place. V'ha'over al divri chachamim chayiv misa, and someone who transgresses the words of the chachamim is liable to die. Chayiv misa. So therefore, the first answer that Tosfos over here is giving is that mace mitzvah kana makayma. Says it in Brachos Daf Daled Mabez, Eruvin Chaf Alf Mabez. You violate what the rabbis say, you're chayiv misa, and that the mace mitzvah is kana makoma. That's another Gemara in Eruvin, also that discusses this idea Eruvin Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, and also Yud Zayin, and that's the first answer. But we're going to focus on this answer. The Harav Rabbeinu Yehuda Mikor Bil. The Ri Mikor Bil says, Teretz the Hasam Yishum the Bittel Atzmo Meshimush Talmidul Chachamim the Kamar Gadol Shimusha Yoisim Lemuda. Over there now. When do we say that you should go bury someone? That's only talking about if you're learning Torah. However, if you're serving your Rebbe, that even overrides a burial, according to Tosfos, according to the Rimi Karbil. And therefore, for Rebbe Akiva, he should have been with his Rebbe. And since he wasn't, it was considered that what? It was considered much worse. And therefore, that's why he's held accountable. He shouldn't have buried. He should have been with his Rebbe. We see the importance over here of serving your Rebbe. Looks like there's another Gillian Hashas over here. He's referencing something. Yeah, he says, Rabbi Kiveger on this Tosfos says, look at Brachos Daf Zayin. Okay, we already did that. That's the Tosfos. Comes along the Ben Yehoyada, the Ben Ish Chai, on his commentary to this Gemara in Brachos. And he says, nearly Nakit Yoiser, Veloy Amar Milimudo. Why does the Gemara say, Kedolo Shimusho Yoiser Milimudo? That it is greater to serve even more than learn? Why not just said, Kedolo Shimusho Milimudo? That it's greater to serve than learn. Why does it say more than? Yoiser. Why do you need that word? This teaches us that there's a tremendous difference between the two. It is so much better to serve your rabbi from a qualitatively spiritual perspective than to learn. It's not a small amount. That's why it's coming to teach us this. It's saying more than yoiser milimudo, to teach us that this is such a great amount over here. That's the Ben Ish Chai's explanation. Comes along the Marsha. What's so important about serving your Rebbe? We really didn't address that yet. A lot of times when you learn by your Rebbe, you're learning a lot of things that aren't practical at all. Can't apply it. That's why it says that it's greater to serve your rabbi because you see on your Rebbe the halachas that are actually going to get applied over here. That's what you see. That you see the halachas that are going to get applied. Everything that is happening is incredibly applicable. Everything is totally applicable. That's why it says what? Gedolu shimusha yosim ilimuda. That's what's so special about serving. That's according to the Marsha. Maratzias, quoted in the Yalkum of Farshim in the back of the Gemara, says Hashimush nikra gam kein limud. Akalimud, hainu, hashameya, limud, hashameya es halachos, v'hashimush hainu haloimid. Mehis nahagus, kemoshe masinu shalcho, talmidun beis hakneses, yiros es hagnos rabam. V'chineinu ech man tachatz amitu kisham, etc. In other words, you're seeing the way that your Rebbe acts. And that's very important. And then he says a story that they went under the Mita, where they followed the Rebbe into the Beis HaKisei. He said, Torah, you've illuminated Sarach. Take a look over there, Brachos Samach Beis Amud Aleph. You'll have what I'm talking about over here. It's Torah, we gotta learn it. Limud Kazeh, when you're following exactly what your Rebbe is doing, Nishrosh B'Leiva Adam, it gets rooted in the heart of a person. Hadroya, the person who sees it, V'Gedoylo Milimud Shali Deshmu, that's better than learning by just hearing something. Kin Ra'isi, that's what I found in the name of the Vilna Gaon. One interesting question that could be asked over here is, well, first of all, let's before we go any further over here, I want to just question the art scroll on Malachim. Okay, if you look at the art scroll on Malachim, Beis in Perek Beis Pasuk Aleph, and you look at their commentary, they say, and I quote, "This is a problem with art that what art scroll did over here. It should be corrected." Why was Elisha chosen to succeed over Eliyahu? Why was it Elisha? Right? What's the reason over here? I quote, Elisha had a virtue that they lacked, just as Yehoshua was chosen to succeed Moshe because he served his master unswervingly and unselfishly. So Elisha became the next primary prophet because he gave up everything without hesitation to serve Eliyahu. It is from Yehoshua and Elisha that the sages, parentheses, brachos, 7b, what we just saw, derive that one gains more from serving Torah scholars than from merely studying under them. What's the obvious problem here? The Gemara and Brachos never learned this from Yehoshua. The Gemara and Brachos only learned this from Elisha. The Gemara and Brachos only learned that it's greater to serve a Torah scholar, talmid chacham, than learn from him. That was learned from Elisha, not Yehoshua. They're saying it's from Yehoshua. That's obviously an issue over there. So, Sarchian on that art scroll. By the way, now that we mentioned it, why didn't the Gemara bring a proof that it's greater to serve a talmid chacham than learn from him from Yehoshua? Wouldn't it be preferable? After all, sefer Yehoshua was going to be given, even if the Jews wouldn't have sinned, like we learned already from the Gemara and Nedarim, Chav Beis, like we discussed in the intro. What's the answer to that? Perhaps the answer could be the pasuk by Elisha is more specific than the pasuk by Yehoshua. This is nearly finisite, according to my humble opinion. By Elisha, the pasuk specifies that Elisha poured water, Asher Yatzak, on the hands of Eliyahu. So since a specific example is used by Elisha, we learn the principle of Gedolah Shimusho from him, that it's greater to serve a talmid chacham. So Sarachin on the art scroll. You have to look into the art scroll's explanation over there. Sefer Netzutzi Hashas comments on this Gemara and says, when you're learning something from your Rebbe, you're only learning one topic. One topic ain't enough. There are a lot of topics to learn out there. But if you serve your Rebbe constantly, you're going to be learning a lot of very relevant topics. That's another important point. Another important point which should be mentioned about this is that by serving a talmid chacham, you enable, when you serve a talmid chacham, the Torah scholar, you enable that Torah scholar to learn more Torah. So that itself is something to consider, because now you're going to cause that talmid chacham to learn more Torah. That's also very important. Very important point. Just want to quote the footnotes of what it says. Sorry about that. Just had to go over to the other shelf, the other side of the room. Just want to quote what it talks about in the footnotes in the Mesivta Gemara when they comment on this Gemara and Brachot that it's greater to serve a talmid chacham because they also say a few points on this. Yeah. It's very hard to organize all of this. It's just a tremendous amount of information from a lot of different places. So just remembered right now that I forgot about the Mesivta. I tried the best I could to try to make it very, very organized, and there's the smallest amount of time to get all this done, not to drag it out in any way, shape, or form. So they comment on this and they say like this in footnote Ayin Gimel Ayin Daled. Yeah. So they're really the main explanation that they give is based on an al-shach that when you learn from the actions of your Rebbe when you serve him. It's basically what they say over there. And they said that the Vilna Gaon says another similar idea in the sefer Imri Noam that to learn practical halacha, so you can learn that easily when you serve your Rebbe and you learn from the actions that he does. Right? However, if you're going to try to learn halacha on your own, that requires a tremendous amount of effort and energy, and you really have to be an expert in learning in order to do that. You have to have a lot of expertise, which is much more difficult. Why is it better to serve a talmid chacham than learn from him? It says in Pirkei Avos, towards the end of the first paragraph, Lo hamedrash hua ikar ela ha'maisa, that the learning isn't the main priority, it's the actions that's the main priority that we care about the most. Rabbi Galinsky actually says it in a funny way, Lo hamedrash hua ikar, it's not the drush, it's not all the Torah that everyone just cares about. Ela ha'maisa, it's the story that everyone cares about. Just say a good story, people will listen. Don't worry, we have stories coming up also about this. But so then they quote the Maritz, but you see on that it's not the learning that's the main thing. It's the mice, it's the actions. So follow the actions of your Rebbe. Then they quote the Maritz that we already discussed as well, and says, look at the El Shach who adds and says that you want to see even the mundane activities, what he does. And with that, you'll understand what the Torah expects of us, even with mundane activities. That's what he says over here. That's basically the idea over here. That's some ideas that that they quote over here that they say in the footnotes that were worthy of a mention. Where am I blanking? I saw somewhere that thought it was gonna be here. I guess it's not here. I saw somewhere that when you serve, you also see how. Oh, you know where that was? That's in the I forgot it. Maybe it was in the Margulies. I tell you. Oh yeah, it was Margulies Shas. I forgot to put it up. Sorry about that. I'm gonna put that up right now. It was in the Margulios Hashas. They actually said a fascinating and very relevant explanation. They said that you're gonna see how he's right over here. They said Pashup shot over here is that you're gonna see how the talmid chacham is mu'uruv mu'urutza bein abrios, how he interacts with other people, which is very important as well. Interactions. When you're just learning and you're reading from books, you're missing a lot of social skills. And you could see that from your Rebbe, the way he acts towards others, which also is very, very important. So that's another reason, social cues and skills, which is a very important idea to keep in mind. Um, so that's another idea. Now, in the art scroll on actual Sefer Yeshua on this pasuk, They go through this, and they, Yehoshua stayed by Moshe's side, they say. He was a student, disciple, servant. He absorbed Moshe's teaching as well through discourse. And Yehoshua was like the moon. Moshe was the sun. Yehoshua was a reflection of Moshe's brilliance. And this way this was his greatness, and this is why Hashem chose him to succeed after Moshe. That's why he was called Eved Hashem, which is a very high level at the end of the day. Take a look at Chaf Dalid, Chaf Tes, and Yehoshua. And they quote the album. Okay, we already saw all that. So that is the art scroll, what they say over here. There's a very interesting idea. Oh, wow. Just realized I do a screen share. And this is kind of a little better late than nowhere. But this is in Even HaEzer in Siman Samech Hey. And it says over here that this is where it talks about that you stop learning in order to go to a chasana over here, right? In order to go to a wedding. So this Piskei Tshuva over here in Gimel. Seems like a very random thing, but we were talking about the Taisvus before in the Gemara and Ksubas that you stop learning to do certain activities. So it says in the Ramah, "Mavatlan talmid Torah lahachnasas kala l'chuppah." Stop learning in order to go to a wedding. So the Piskei Tshuva over here says, "I am ber hetiv." Okay, then on the next page, he says, "Va'ayim b'shal tshuvas yad Eliyahu." So in talmid v'remez he brings a hint to this. Eis sefod ve'eis code. The Sukkot in Koheles, it says there's a time for this, there's a time for that, time for that, time for this, and then it says look, ace, ace, this, ace, that. There's a time for this, but there's always a lamed before, except for ace sefod and acer code. There's a time to give a eulogy and a time to dance. Take a look in Koheles and Gimel Daled to understand what it's talking about. Below lamed, Lahirus teaches us to mevatlin talmid Torah lahotzas emes, that we stop learning Torah to go to a funeral, and to go to a wedding. In other words, we see from over here this idea that you have to drop the lamed. What's the lamed? The lamed symbolizes the limud, the learning. You drop the learning. So that symbolizes. That was just a side point based on from the Taisvos before that I wanted to speak out. So that is basically a lot of explanations as to why it is that it is greater to serve a talmid chacham than to learn from one, derived from this pasuk. The question is practically, how should this be done? So the sefer Otzar HaMidrashim says that Yehoshua merited, they quote the Yalkut Shimoni actually, initially. It says that why did Yehoshua merit being the leader? Because he served, like we just saw. What did he do to serve practically? You know what Yehoshua did? Hayamekavdu upayis hasodin alasafsel. He would honor Moshe and he would spread a sheet on the bench. V'yoshiv tachas raglav. And he would sit. Yehoshua would sit under Moshe's feet. Lefikach amar Kodesh Baruch Hu eine mekapeach scharecha. And Hashem said, therefore, I will not withhold any reward from you because you did this. And so he said, I'm not gonna withhold any reward from you. That's what Hashem said. Next page, they said, you didn't need to wear maturim when Yehoshua was around because he merited such a high level. Then it says, I also see in my notes, look at the Tana de Beliahu Rabba Parakeh Osvav, that serving a chacham is better than learning, like we said. And we find by Yehoshua that it says in Bamidbar Yoda Aleph Kaf Ches V'Yan Yehoshua ben Nun Misharis Moshe. It doesn't say that he was a talmid. It says that he served Misharis Moshe. So we see he was serving. What would he do to serve? Hayanotel es he would take a bucket basically, and he would take clothing that they would wear when they would go to the house, and he would go fill it for Moshe, fill the bucket. Simple chores, simple tasks. What was the service that he would do? Yeshua would get up every single day and he would select the best of the man. And he would say, Zeh l'Rebbe Moshe, Zeh l'Rabbeinu Moshe. This is for my Rebbe Moshe. This is for our master Moshe. That's what he would do. That's the idea over here. The Moram Lo'ez elaborates. Moram Lo'ez says like this. Why over here is Yeshua called a servant of Moshe? Because he didn't merit this whole reason because of his wisdom that he had. He was young. When Moshe went up to the mountain to receive the Torah, Yehoshua, he was waiting for Moshe to come down. He waited at the bottom of the mountain, like how a servant waits for his master. And once Moshe went to the mountain, Yehoshua, he remained down there, like how a servant waits for his master. He would wait, waiting to greet him. It's like when a person goes to a palace, he waits there for the king. He waited 40 days and 40 nights. Parshas Beshalach, it talks about Yeshua over there. It doesn't say that he was a servant of Moshe. However, in Parshas Mishpatim later on, it says Vayaka Moshe Yeshua Misharto. He calls Yeshua a servant. How do you get that? The answer is, once he waited there for such a long time, that's why he was called a servant. So for those 40 days and nights that he waited, Hashem performed the miracle. Hashem provided man just for Yehoshua so that he had something to eat. From that time and on, he never stopped serving Moshe. He would sweep the yeshiva. Yeshua would sweep the yeshiva. He would organize the benches, the chairs in the yeshiva, and he would prepare his Rebbe's chair. He would sit like a servant. That's why Yeshua merited the Keser Torah, the crown of Torah. Like Chazal say, it's greater to serve than learn from a talmid chacham. Because if a person is going to serve his Rebbe, so then he will merit that the little bit of Torah that he learns will have atzlacha b'limudo, will have tremendous success with that. And his eyes will light up from that. And he will merit a lot more than a student, than a talmid who learns a lot but doesn't serve his Rebbe. See, Yeshua merited receiving the Torah from Moshe because of this. Moshe kibel Torah misinai u'masar Yeshua. Moshe gave it to Yeshua like we just said before. Because the Torah made him king. Hemlich oiso, hektira oiso. Made him king. Made him a leader. That's why he merited being a leader. And not Moshe's children. Because Hashem told Moshe, no, take Yeshua. B'midbar Chav Zayin. Yeshua is going to be the one. Take your student Yeshua. Yeshua, he's fitting to fill your place since he served you properly. Since he gave you the respect in everyone else's eyes. Now he's got to get that back. You got to look at him differently. He's a different person. It's another reason why he merited this level. He cared about his Rebbe's honor. We find in Parshas Ba'aloischa when Eldad and Medad, when they were prophesying in the camp, Yehoshua said, "What's going on over here? Check out if they are obligated to die because of the situation or not." In Yeshua's eyes, it looked like it was belittling Moshe if they're going to prophesy while he's alive. That is the characteristic of an eved, of a slave. He worries about all the necessities of his Rebbe, and he's worried about his honor. That's why he merited the crown of Torah. And then afterwards, he merited being the leader of the Jews. So because he guarded the honor of his Rebbe, he merited that the prophecy would remain on him. And after Moshe passed, he didn't need to ask the Urim and the Tumim anymore about anything. So those are some practical ways how a person could serve his Rebbe, and it depends. I remember very clearly. I mean, I have a pretty good memory in general. I mean, I forget a lot that I learn, unfortunately. But you know, that's because if enough chazar isn't done, you're gonna forget it. But certain things I remember very, very well, and especially if I remind myself about it. So mentally. So I remember when I first gave this year, I think it was like 8 years ago. I could look back in the files and the original recordings. I mean, this is on rabbivan.com and Yehoshua. Not as long as this, and I added and I grew a lot from learning this again, and it's very enjoyable to speak about this again. It helps me remember it more. But so I remember this was during the summer, and I remember that winter, one or two of the people who were there when I gave this year, they went over to my car and they cleaned the snow off. And it was snowing with the thing, so I didn't need to. I remember, I mean, think about whatever is a practical way of helping with your Rebbe. That's what should be done. I'm gonna end with two stories. If you made it this far, good for you. We have Pesach Kron in the sefer in the footsteps of the Maggid, page 34. Closest Gemara says that it's better to serve a talmid chacham than to learn from him. Quotes the Marsha, and we said, quotes everything that we just saw. Then he tells a story about Rabbi Yisrael Belsky, Zatzal, from Rosh Yeshiva of Torah Vadas in Brooklyn. It has to do with the talmid serving his Rebbe by pouring water over his hands, actually. So even though the sensitivity that was witnessed is remarkable, it almost went unnoticed. Only in retrospect, you could realize what happened. It was in 1954, and there was a young bacher, still in his teens, and he left the Mesivta. He left Torah Vadas in Williamsburg, where he was learning, to go learn in one of the most prominent yeshivas in America. It was Beis Medrash Elon in Monsey, New York. The Rosh Yeshiva at the time was one of the Gedolei Hador, Rabbi Ruvain Grzovsky, who was nifter and passed away in 1958, son-in-law of Reb Baruch Ber Leibowitz. When the Bachar came to the yeshiva, Ruvain was already ill. He suffered a stroke, which left the right side of his body paralyzed. So the talmidim, the students in the Beis Medrash, Elon were given certain assignments on a rotation basis. So the newcomers were initiated almost immediately. The assignments included traveling to a nearby farm, watching the cows being milked, to make sure that the milk for the yeshiva community would be considered Chal Yisrael, putting away this farm, which had been used by the Bachrim and the Beis Medrash throughout the day, which is so important. I left one of my Sfar, I mean, I have a lot of Sfarim in another place, in a shul. It's where I learn, and someone took one of the Sfarim. I don't know where it is. It's really annoying. I have notes in it. It's terrible. In another shul in the allude over here, they have a sign that says, anyone who doesn't put back his farm, it's considered as if you stole. Have it in Hebrew, English, I think maybe even Russian or something. Yeah, come on. So they would also assist the sick Rosh Hashiva by sleeping in his room at night and being available to tend to his needs, including washing his left and only mobile hand with nagelwasser when you wash in the morning. When he woke up in the morning, he also had to hold a sitter so that he could recite the Birchas Shachar, to which then the Bachar would respond, Amen, after the Rosh Hashiva finished each bracha and putting on the Rosh Hashiva's tefillin on his arm and head. So even though Reb Ruvain had a dedicated male nurse who attended him throughout the day, the Bachrim did these chores every morning before the gentleman arrived. Assisting Reb Ruvain was not an easy task because his stroke caused his speech to be slurred, making it hard to understand his requests. In addition, his left hand would sometimes jerk spontaneously and uncontrollably, making it difficult to put on his tefillin. On the morning that this particular Bachar was to help Reb Ruvain, the young man was noticeably nervous. This would be the first time that he would be so close to this world-renowned Rosh Hashiva. He had been forewarned that his task might not be easy, but he was hoping for the best. What happened was the worst. As soon as he heard Reb Reuben stir, the Bachar followed the instructions of those who had done it before, filled a cup of water, which he held in one hand, and carried a large basin in the other hand to catch the water after it was poured over Reb Reuven's hand. He approached the bed with great trepidation. Reb Reuven, lying on his back, extended his left hand so that the Bachar, whom he never saw before, could pour the water over it. But as the young Bachar began to pour the water, an uncontrollable spasm caused Reb Reuven to suddenly pull his hand back, and the water went straight from the cup into the basin. The Bachar felt foolish and somewhat helpless, but knew he would have to try it again. He took a step closer to the bed as Reuben once again extended his thin, wavering hand. The Bachar tipped the cup and began to pour, but in his haste and nervousness, and in his eagerness to wash the hand before it could jerk back, he accidentally spilled water onto the bed, where it splashed all over the sheet and onto Reb Reuven's clothes. The young boy felt more ashamed and humiliated than he ever had felt before. He wished he could be anywhere but where he was. However, he still had his chores to complete, and only then could he head back to the base medrash to catch the morning minyan. He tried once again, determined that this time he wouldn't spill water any place but on the Rosh Hashiva's hands, and he finally managed to accomplish his task, and he poured the water 3 times. He wiped Reuben's hand, and then got a sitter from which Reuben recited the brachas out loud. As Reuben peered into the sitter, the young Bachar could not take his eyes off the drenched sheet. He answered Amen. He was upset and embarrassed, and he proceeded to put the Rosh Hashiva's tefillin on. He had just turned to leave so that he could get to the minyan on time when he heard the Rosh Hashiva call him. "What is your name?" Reuben inquired. The Bachar answered, Yisrael Belsky. He became the great Rabbi Belsky, Rosh Hashiva, and Poisik, Torah Vadas, in charge of OU. Reuben asked him to sit down and engaged him in some small talk. Rosh Hashiva inquired about his family, his former yeshiva, and his current chavrusas, study partner. Slowly the Bachar began to relax as Reuben thanked him for being of assistance. After a few minutes, Reuben bid the young man good day and wished him hatzlacha in his stay at the base medrash Elon. Bachar left the home of Reuben in a relaxed frame of mind. He had undergone an awful and awkward morning, but the soothing voice of the Rosh Hashiva had calmed him. A few days later, the Bachar told some of his friends what had transpired between him and Reuben. The Bachrim in the base medrash were shocked. Not one of them could recall Reuben ever talking with his tefillin on. The Bachrim began to ask one another and to inquire of the other Rosh Yeshiva as well, whether anyone had ever heard Reuben talk once he had his tefillin on. So it became clear, and this was confirmed by the family members, that as long as anyone could remember, Reuben had never intentionally uttered a word aside for those of davening, of tefillah, prayer, and Torah while wearing his tefillin. Sior HaChaim, Siman Kafches, Sif Aleph Mishnah Brura, over there, in Sif Katan Mem Daled. And yet, for the sake of a Bacher, whom we did not know, who had become uncomfortable and humiliated in his presence, Reuben felt compelled to be lenient about something that he had adhered to and followed his entire life so carefully, not to speak while wearing his tefillin. Stringency, but he kept it, but he went against it for feelings. His priority at that moment was so calm, a young Bacher, so that his day of learning and sense of his priority at that moment was to calm a young Bacher, young boy, so that his day of learning and sense of self-value would not be destroyed. Decades later, Rabbi Belsky, who himself has nurtured thousands of talmidim students, remembered that incident as a shining example of a Rebbe's sensitivity to a talmid. To experience that event was to experience the statement that we're discussing, Gedol Shem Musho, Yoisim Elimudo. That's what that means. To end with one more idea. Skipped anything? Yep, covered everything. By Yaakov Bender, Rosh Yeshiva of Darchei Torah. Beautiful sefer on the avoda. Page 74. Ma'aseh B'Reb Eliezer, the story with the 5 rabbis in the Haggadah. The Rambam in Hilchos Chametz to Matzah, Perek Zayin Halacha Ches rules that a talmid, a student, should not sit behesebo, should not recline in front of his Rebbe. Whole discussion in the Gemara. The Rebbe allows it, it's fine. Comes up in Torah Shulchan Aruch, Sugis in Arvei Psachim. Okay, not for now. His Rebbe gives you permission, you could recline. The Shultos explains that the kavod for the Rebbe, the honor for the rabbi, takes precedence over the mitzvah of haseba, of reclining. Reclining, haseba, means demonstrating cheres, freedom, a manifestation of our freedom from para. But showing respect for Rebbe is an inherent part of kavod Torah, of honoring Torah, the process whereby Torah is transmitted from one generation to another, which was itself the primary point of the Exodus, Yetzias Mitzrayim. Then he quotes this whole idea with Yehoshua. Yeshua is called Tiklik and Shmos in Lamed Gimel Yud Aleph, that he was called a nar. A nar is someone that's young. It seems like it's an insult. Why was he called a nar? Torah seems to praise Yeshua by calling him a nar. The answer is, when it comes to a Rebbe-Talmud relationship, there's no greater compliment. When it comes to the relationship between a Rebbe and a student, there's no greater compliment. He brings a lot of stories about this. Now he continues to bring stories. He says that students that would accompany Rav Shlomo Feifeld on his Chol HaMoed visits to his own Rebbe, Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, would marvel at the change that came over the Rosh Yeshiva. Rav Shlomo was a big man with a personality to match, but as he would ascend the steps of his Rebbe's home, he would start to tremble with awe and trepidation, barely able to speak. "We are going to the Rabbi, to the Rebbe, our source of hashpah, of influence," he would whisper. Brings another story with Rav Aaron Kotler, and he says Rav Mordechai Gifter once wondered why the chacham sefer was blessed with generations of talmidei chachamim that came from him, of Torah scholars. There are many great gedolim, there are many great rabbis who didn't marry such a thing. Rabbi Gifter pointed out, so what was the merit of the chacham sefer? So the Telz Rosh Yeshiva suggested that the chacham sefer, he was a towering gadol, a great person of his own generation and the subsequent generations as well. But he was known as a devoted talmid to his rebbeim. He was known as a student to Rav Nosson Adler and the Haflah. That's why he merited it, because he was a great student. Someone who lives with the Rebbe understands the importance of hashpah and is thus a more effective mashpia. He'll be better at influencing others as well. Yeshua was a nar. He was a young kid when he was in the presence of his Rebbe, seeing only the greatness and splendor of Moshe, completely subservient to his Rebbe in every way, shape, or form. Chaim Shmulevitz would speak about this Rashi and what it teaches us. The Rashi that Yeshua would wait on the bottom of Har Sinai. Talmud is so eager for one more minute of his Rebbe's time that he walks until he is permitted to walk no further and stands and wait for his Rebbe to return so that he could immediately reconnect with his Rebbe. Yehoshua understood what time with Moshe Rabbeinu was worth, and he refused to give up on a single moment. He could have left and returned after 40 days. What if he had forfeited his place in line? What if that decision to opt for convenience would have cost him a moment with his Rebbe? Therefore, he waited. And then basically he rips people who are waiting on Black Friday for all this stuff, material and just physical possessions. We see what's important to wait for. Spirituality, not physicality. Yeshua is the quintessential Talmud student, and he shows us what dedication means. And that's why, if you made it till here, you understand why it's so important to be called a servant. Why it's so important to serve your Rebbe, even more than learning from your Rebbe. Stay tuned for the next one.